Welcome to another episode of Tales from the Hangman's Record. My name is Steve Fielding. These stories are taken from my 3-volume series of books, The Hangman's Record, covering every execution in Great Britain and Ireland between 1868 and 1964. Copies of these, and many of my other titles, can be obtained through my website, stevefielding.com. If you enjoy the video, please subscribe and press like to help us reach a wider audience. If you can spare £1 or $2 to help the channel to continue to grow, donations can be made by clicking the thanks button below the video or in the link paypal.me/thehangmansrecord. As always, use the comments below for thoughts on the case, whether justice was seen to be done, and suggestions for future episodes in the series are always welcomed. For today's story, we travel back to 1896. Queen Victoria has been on the throne since 1837, and later in this year would become the country's longest ever serving monarch, a record that held until September 2015. Conservative Robert Gascoigne Cecil, 3rd Marquess of Salisbury, is serving his 3rd term as Prime Minister, and across the Atlantic, Democrat Stephen Grover Cleveland is midway through his 2nd term in the White House. In Canada, Wilfrid Laurier becomes their 7th Prime Minister and the first French speaker to hold office. It is a year that would see the first X-ray photographs and the first modern Olympic Games take place in Athens. Railways are the most popular form of transport, and in December, Glasgow becomes just the 3rd city in the world to have an underground metro. Although the first motor car had only appeared on the roads 2 years earlier, 1896 was to see the first speeding conviction when a motorist in Kent was fined for travelling at 8 miles an hour, 4 times over the speed limit. And in August, the first recorded fatality of a pedestrian killed by a motor vehicle takes place in London. Music hall is the most popular form of entertainment, with Albert Chevalier, Gus Ellen, Mary Lloyd and Little Tich amongst the most successful. Employment in the UK is high, with the majority of men working in industry, with engineering, construction and mining amongst the most common jobs. Many women work in domestic service for the middle and upper class, with maids, cooks and housekeepers the most popular role. And many women and girls are being employed in the cotton and textile mills, and more are now working as clerical workers and typists. Conditions are still harsh, with many on low wages and living on the breadline, and it was common for children as young as 9 to be working up to 40 hours a week in mills and factories. And, in London, 2 brutal crimes take place that will see the killers standing side by side on the gallows at Newgate Jail that summer. It was the early morning of Friday the 14th of February, St Valentine's Day, 1896, as jobbing gardener Charles Webber arrived for work in the grounds of Muswell Lodge, a large old house in Tetherdown on the outskirts of Hornsey at the North London suburb of Muswell Hill. The imposing residence, with a large garden dotted with greenhouses and a large sweeping drive, was the home to 80-year-old Henry Smith. Widowed many years before, Smith stood over 17 stone and sported a bushy grey beard, and despite it being a large roomy house, he preferred to live quietly, and rather than a retinue of staff and being a keen gardener, he just relied on the services of Webber to help tend to the extensive grounds and the occasional handyman job. The sky was heavy with the threat of snow and the ground covered in a hard frost as Webber arrived for work in the greenhouses. Finding the kitchen door open, he stepped inside and recoiled in horror at the sight that greeted him. Dressed in just a blood-spattered nightshirt, Henry Smith lay sprawled across the floor in a pool of blood. His limbs were tied, a gag had been drawn tightly around the lower part of his head and forced into his mouth, and dried blood covered his matted grey hair. Webber stood in shock before closing the door and heading back down the drive and out of the gates before breaking into a run, and was shaking badly when he arrived at Hornsey police station. "Old Mr. Smith's been murdered," he gasped to the desk sergeant as he burst into the station. Inspector Charles Nutkins, in charge of the local CID, headed straight to the scene, whilst in the meantime a message was sent to Scotland Yard asking for reinforcements. Short time later, Chief Inspector Marshall arrived at Muswell Lodge, and together the two detectives went through the house carefully. They found it easy to piece together the events of the previous night. The ransacked bedroom and the open safe, and signs of a terrible struggle, showed that the old man had been battered to death during the course of a robbery. It was also clear that Henry Smith had been overpowered after putting up a great fight. Although the attack had been carried out with much violence, it seemed clear the level of resistance must have shaken the killer's nerve, and the search of the house had not been as thorough as intended. Items of jewellery had been overlooked, and in a basket in the scullery opening off the kitchen, the detectives found a gold watch. There was no sign of any money, but in the kitchen sink, beneath the dripping tap, was a small lantern and a box of matches. "What do you make of this?" Nutkins said, turning to his colleague. "It's a toy lantern," Marshall said, as he handled the strange discovery. "I can't think it's the old man's, but what kind of burglar would use such a thing?" For the time being, there was no answer to that question. A search of the flower beds outside revealed footprints that suggested two intruders, and someone had disconnected the tripwires of the old man's ingenious alarm system. There were marks clearly made by a jemmy on the windowsills in the drawing room and scullery, but attempts to open them had been unsuccessful, as, fearing such a robbery, Smith had had the windows screwed down. Only the kitchen window had been forced. "Two of them, and they know this business. These are no amateurs," Marshall told his colleague. "Yet they bring a kid's penny toy to light the scene. It doesn't make sense." They didn't expect to leave it behind, Nutkins mused. It was probably knocked into the sink during the fight, got wet, and they had to use a candle. There was one in the bedroom. As the detectives began to piece together the events that led to the murder, they felt it was clear what had happened. The noise of the forced entry had wakened the old man, who had come into the kitchen and challenged them. They had stopped his struggles and stifled his cries with the gag. The detective's only tangible clue was the toy lantern, which could be found in any toy shop. What made this one different, though, was that it contained an unusual homemade wick that appeared to have been crudely fashioned from a piece of flannel undergarment. But would the clue prove helpful? By the end of the 19th century, Scotland Yard's modus operandi system was already firmly established. The result of processes started and developed by Adolphus Dolly Williamson, the first head of the Metropolitan Police Detective Branch at Scotland Yard, this new school of sleuths had devised a carefully arranged method of logging and filing inquiries. It was still many years before fingerprint evidence would be used in court to convict a murderer, but criminals were already classified according to their associates and known methods of working. Inspector Nutkins had the local area swamped with plainclothes and uniform officers making inquiries, and soon found a Mrs. Kate Good, who told of being accosted by two men a couple of days before the murder close to her home at Tetherdown Road. Apart from the fact that they seemed rather rough in manner, one had inquired about the times of late trains from Muswell Hill station, while the other had asked if there was an entrance into the woods from the gardens of certain houses close to Muswell Lodge. Nutkins then found a Mrs. Helen Whiten, who remembered seeing two strangers, also of rough appearance, in a little frequented lane not far from Muswell Lodge, on the morning of the 12th of February. She said she would have taken no notice of them, but for the fact one of them turned and glared at her malevolently, as though resenting her presence. "Sounds as though they could be our pair," Marshall agreed, when the two went through the statements. "I'll check with our ticket of leave men," he added, aware that a number of released convicts, classed as ticket of leave men, would invariably fail to report to the police once they became involved in fresh criminal activity. Marshall had a memo sent to all metropolitan police stations, and one of those who read it was Detective Constable Burrell, attached to Kentish Town Police Station, some 3 or 4 miles from Muswell Hill. For some weeks, Burrell had been interested in the activities of a local criminal, 33-year-old Albert Milsom, who he had seen drinking in public houses with Henry Fowler, a 31-year-old ticket of leave ex-convict with a past record for extreme violence. Fowler, known by the nickname Bunny, was a thick-set man with a deep-barreled chest and a vicious temper, which quickly became inflamed when he met opposition to his wishes or fancied he had a grievance. It struck the observant Burrell that before the murder both men had been dressed shabbily, but on the 15th, just 2 days later, both were now dressed in new clothes. Burrell called at Milsom's back street home on Southey Street, North Kensington, where he was met by a pale-faced woman with suspicious dark eyes. He asked about Henry Fowler and noted she seemed flustered and said her husband had gone away to get a job and claimed she didn't know where he was. Burrell reported this to Marshall and Nutkins. Other inquiries were being made across the city, and one clue emerged after a visit to the murdered man's bank. Marshall learned that on the night of the murder, Smith had a £10 Bank of England note, the number of which had been recorded by the cashier who had paid it out. The note was found to be missing from the safe. A search at Muswell Lodge failed to locate it, and detectives assumed the note had gone with the rest of the haul. The serial number of the £10 note was passed on to banks, and a watch was kept for it at the Bank of England, and a few weeks later it was paid in. Marshall went to work and the note was traced to a firm of London tea merchants, and after further questioning, established that it had come to them from a grocer's in the East End. £10 notes were something of a rarity, and not paid across the counter every day of the week. Marshall visited the grocer's shop and learned that it had been used to settle the accounts of a publican who had paid cash in settlement of his monthly bill. "Damn me if I didn't think it might bring trouble," the publican said when questioned by the detective. Fortunately, he was able to give a description of the man who had changed the note in the bar. It fitted perfectly Henry Fowler. Marshall believed Fowler's strength and ugly manner might have been used to intimidate the publican into accepting the note and changing it for the customer. Then another piece of the puzzle fell into place. Examining the toy lantern, Nutkins was certain it did not belong to Henry Smith, and gardener Charles Webber said he could not recall ever seeing it before. Then, after reading Burrell's report, Nutkins also called to speak to Mrs. Milsom. He learned that her husband was still away, and found her at the house with her 2 young children and a surly lad of 16 who she introduced as Henry Miller, her young brother. With Milsom still absent and sensing that they knew more than they were saying, he cut short the interview and telling them he would be back. Nutkins had a watch kept on the house. When he was told Mrs. Milsom was out shopping, he called and spoke to the children. He was prepared for a wall of silence from youngsters brought up to believe the police were enemies, but when he produced a toy lantern, the response was immediate. "Hey, that's mine," said Henry Miller, snatching at it. "Where did you get it, mister?" "How do I know you're telling the truth?" Nutkins coaxed. "That's easy. Miller said he had bought the lantern for a penny in a shop he named. It had red and green lenses like a railway guard's lantern, and he had broken the green glass. He said he had tried to remove some varnish spilled on the bullseye bulb by sandpapering it, and he had inserted a new wick." "What sort of wick?" Nutkin asked, and the lad didn't hesitate. "Flannel. My sister had some pieces left over after making the kids' clothes." So it was Henry Miller's lantern, and Albert Milson, his brother-in-law, lived in the same house. This was now a vital part of Nutkin's investigation. If the boy was able to tell his sister what had happened, he would be told to deny what he had said, so he had the boy taken to the police station. Here, Henry Miller said he had wedged a piece of broken pen holder around the wick to hold it firm, and he had put the mended lantern on the kitchen dresser. When he noticed it missing, he claimed Milson had said, "Keep your mouth shut about the lantern, Harry, if you know what's good for you. If anyone asks, you broke it, see, and you chucked it in the dustbin." The detectives now had their suspects, but where were they hiding? As the hunt for the Muswell Hill murderers continued across the city, residents living in and around the Commercial Road in the Whitechapel district of East London were still living in the fear that Jack the Ripper would strike again. It was less than a decade since a horrific series of murders had suddenly ceased, and with no arrest made, there was always the underlying worry that the killer's reign of terror would restart. Then, in August 1896, was another horrific murder that put Whitechapel back on the newspaper front pages. Situated at the junction of Varden Street and Turner Street, number 31 was a 3-storey, 8-room house and the home of 74-year-old John Goodman Levy and his married housekeeper, 37-year-old Annie Sarah Gale. In December 1895, a few months after the death of his wife and crippled with arthritis, Levi had finally retired from the umbrella case manufacturing business he ran in partnership with his stepson, Jacob Myers, handing him sole control. Levi was believed to keep a large amount of gold and jewellery on the premises, and several times in early 1896 the house was targeted by burglars. As a result, the police constable whose beat took in the area was told to keep a sharp eye on the house at night. Shortly before 1 o'clock on Easter Saturday afternoon, the 4th of April, 7-year-old Billy Whittaker called round at the house with an invitation for Levi to come to dinner. There was no answer to his knocking, so he went home and said he hadn't been able to deliver the message. His mother, Martha Lawton, Levi's cousin, then went to the house, knocking at the door for some minutes without any response. The loud and constant rapping attracted the attention of next-door neighbour William Schaefer, who went out to investigate. She told him she was worried that no one was answering and that Levi had not visited the synagogue that morning. She then suggested they go to the backyard and see if they could see anything by climbing on the wall. Schaefer put a ladder against the wall and was shocked to see the head of a strange man in a brown cloth cap just inside the small window in the narrow corridor leading to the front doorway. He shouted out to the stranger, who immediately disappeared from view. A few minutes later the man reappeared again, and moments after he came into view, Schaefer demanded to know what he was doing there. Now convinced something was clearly amiss, Schaefer ran through the house and ran to the street to go in search of a policeman. Here he found the commotion had brought other neighbours to gather in front of Levi's front door. PCs Henry Richardson and Fred Wensley, on duty locally, were quickly at the scene. Schaefer led them into number 29, where they scaled the wall and climbed into Levi's house, telling two men to keep watch on the front and back of the premises to prevent the man making his escape until reinforcements could arrive. It didn't take long for the officers to see that this was a murder scene. Half hidden behind the lavatory door on the ground floor, they found the body of John Levi lying in a pool of blood. His throat had been cut from ear to ear and the back of the skull battered in with what appeared, from the nature of the wounds, to be a hammer. The head and face of the dead man, as well as his clothing, were covered in bloodstains, and such was the level of savagery, death must have been instantaneous. Continuing their search of the house, officers found drawers ransacked and overturned, and a safe in a first-floor room had been turned around, presumably so the killer could attempt to force it open from the back. In the housekeeper's bedroom on the second floor was another ghastly sight. The body of Annie Gale lay on the floor by the side of the bed, in a pool of blood, while splashes were visible on several of the walls. She had been terribly mutilated, her head almost severed, and, as in the case of the whole man, her skull had been savagely beaten with the blunt instrument. It was evident that while in the act of making the bed, the housekeeper must have been taken by surprise. She had then fought bravely for her life before succumbing to the wounds. Every room was in a state of total disorder, and as the detectives passed from room to room, they spotted a hole in the ceiling giving access to the roof. The lath and plaster had been smashed, and a hole large enough for a man to climb through had been made. It seemed clear that the killer had still been on the premises when the police had arrived and was now trying to make his escape. Just as the officers had discovered the hole in the ceiling, there was a loud cry from the street below that there was a man on the roof. A ladder was quickly fetched from Schaefer's yard, and PC Wensley used it to climb onto the roof, and as he did so caught sight of the man standing in the gutter. As PC Wensley made his way across the slates, the murderer, seeing he had no chance of making an escape across the roof, climbed over the coping and dropped into the street below. In the 3-storey house it was a distance of almost 50 foot. A group of sightseers stood directly below as he plummeted to the ground, striking and badly injuring a young girl, Leah Hyams, at the time standing with her mother next to the Vernon Street entrance. Although the unfortunate girl had partly broken his fall, the man struck the pavement with a dull thud and struck his head on the ground, temporarily knocking him insensible. PC Richardson seized hold and put him into handcuffs, and found the man had with him 2 bundles in which he collected together his plunder, including several watches, a number of rings and other jewellery, as well as a large quantity of money. Other property identified as belonging to the old man was also discovered hidden in his pockets. An ambulance was summoned and the killer, who had clearly sustained serious injuries, had to be protected by the police from the clutches of an angry crowd who had gathered in the street below before he was conveyed by constables to the nearby Royal London Hospital. The little girl, Leah Hyams, was also knocked unconscious, but was taken to a neighbour's house, where restoratives were applied. On being brought to, she was then taken to hospital, where it was found she had suffered injuries to her back and was suffering from shock, but on the following morning she was considered to have sufficiently recovered to be sent home. The man remained in an insensible condition throughout the night, and it was not until Sunday afternoon that consciousness returned. Louis Smith, the senior house surgeon, ascertained he was suffering from concussion, a fractured right shoulder and injuries to his right leg. Detective Inspector Henry Marshall, still involved in the Muswell Hill investigation, travelled to Whitechapel, where he identified the man as 46-year-old local housebreaker William Seaman, one of a daring gang of burglars who had infested the metropolis in many recent years past. Seaman was a thick-set man, between 5'8" and 9 inches in height, with slightly bent shoulders and a small tuft of red whiskers, and was known to be notoriously violent. He also used several aliases and had a long criminal record. Immediately upon the discovery of the bodies being made, 2 local doctors were sent for. So terrible was the nature of the wounds that had been inflicted, they confirmed that the cause of death must in each case have been instantaneous. There was little doubt that William Seaman had murdered John Goodman Levy and Annie Sarah Gale on the 4th of April, and that the murders had taken place some time after breakfast, as evidence was established that the couple had eaten as usual that morning. The murders had been committed by a clasp knife and a heavy hammer, both of which had been found clotted with blood on the roof and must have been dropped by Seaman in the hurried flight when discovered by the police. The bodies of the victims were removed to the mortuary to await the inquest, and a few days later, on Tuesday the 7th of April, the funeral of John Levy took place at the Jewish cemetery in Leytonstone. On the following Saturday, the funeral of Annie Gale took place at Ilford Cemetery. Seaman was reported to have made a pathetic sight when he appeared at the Thames Police Court on Friday the 1st of May. Still in considerable pain, suffering from the injuries he had sustained in the jump from the roof, he had to be carried into court in an armchair. The right sleeve of his coat was empty and pinned against his breast, while his head was supported by a large pillow. The short hearing ended with him remanded in custody, pending his subsequent Old Bailey trial. The hunt for Albert Milsom and Henry Fowler took a new twist when detectives learned that Milsom's wife had received a letter with a Liverpool postmark. Inspector Marshall suspected that the killers had travelled to the northwest seaport to escape on a transatlantic liner. He sent 2 detectives to Liverpool to check on manifests, but found nobody matching their descriptions had boarded any ship, while further investigations found that Milsom and Fowler had been spending money freely across the city. From Liverpool, the trail first led to Manchester and then on to Cardiff, where all trace of the wanted pair were lost until police learned that they had changed their names to Taylor and Scott, and that the proprietor of a travelling waxwork show had hired them for a Welsh tour. Marshall wondered why they remained together with the man-hunt on, and deduced they simply did not dare to separate as they didn't trust each other. The trail was then picked up across South Wales, from Pontypool to Newport and across to Bristol Channel. In Bristol they learned that a man answering Milsom's description had travelled to London and had come back with his wife and 2 children. More inquiries were made in London, and it was found Milsom had not been near his home, but his wife and children were now missing. Her brother, Henry Miller, was already in a home found for him by the police. From Bristol, the trail was again picked up in Swindon, where the wanted men had adopted fresh aliases, Stevenson and Walsh. It took a week to catch up with them, this time in the old Roman city of Bath. Night was falling when plainclothes men made their way unobtrusively down Monmouth Street to take up stations which allowed continuous watch to be kept on a shop and rooms over where they believed the fugitives were holed up. Shortly after 11 o'clock, in the company of a number of Bath police officers, Scotland Yard inspectors Marshall and Nutkins, along with Detective Constable Burrell, who could identify both men, raided the premises. A sergeant from the Bath police force was the first man to break through the forced door of the locked room. Nutkins was close behind, a revolver in his hand. Milsom collapsed in terror, moaning, "Oh my God, the cops," as he was arrested and quickly handcuffed. Fowler was not so tame. Inspector Marshall later made a statement giving his official version of those dramatic moments. I made for Fowler. The room was very poorly lighted, quite a simple gleam of the lamp, and we could not see very much. I seized Fowler, and another officer or two seized him instantly. He became most desperate. He aimed a blow which caught me across the top of the hat I was wearing and smashed it, and I think I smashed his. There was a general row. He nearly swayed some of us down. I drew my revolver and struck him across the head with it. Nutkins presented a loaded revolver, but that seemed to have no effect. As a last resort, I struck him with an unloaded revolver. I think I struck him 2 or 3 times on the forehead. He fell down eventually, and we got the handcuffs on him. Fowler's gun was tucked inside the upholstery of a couch. Milson, running short of funds, had pawned his. Taken into custody, they were kept separate, and after being charged, the two reacted differently when returned to London and held in adjacent cells in the fearsome Newgate jail. Fowler remained contemptuous, while Milsom's collapse became complete. He made a full confession to Nutkins, in which he attempted to throw all responsibility and blame for the burglary and the capital crime on Fowler. He gave them some additional information and told how their jemmies and other tools had been buried under some shrubs in the centre of the garden lawn. He told Nutkins that after the murder they were creeping about when they came to a stump of a tree where they sat for 3 or 4 hours, waiting for 6 o'clock when the police would be scarce, thinking of escaping detection. We came out onto the same path we went in and then walked all the way home, he said. Fowler wore my brown coat to hide the blood-stained clothes. When we got near home, he said he would go to his brother's for breakfast and meet me in a couple of hours' time. I went home and went to bed. Fowler called on me about 10 o'clock and had a parcel under his arm that contained new clothes. He said, "Send the missus out so I can change my clothes." He then gave me £50 and said, "That's more than some would give you after leaving a man in a hole," implying that Milson had been outside when the murder was committed. I took the £50 and said nothing. Fowler first heard of this testimony when the two stood side by side in the dock at the magistrate's court. He listened stunned as Milsom's statement was read out, and then during the lunch adjournment he made a fresh statement of his own. "My pal, the dirty dog, has turned Queen's evidence," he shouted in a rage. "But I can tell a tale as well as he. There was £112 in the bag in the safe, and I gave him £53 and some shillings, which was an equal share of the money after what I had spent. Is it likely I should give that to a man who stood outside? He put his foot on the old man's neck until he was sure he was dead. Then we went upstairs, he first, and found the old man's trousers with the keys in the pocket for the safe. William Seaman and then Milsom and Fowler appeared before Mr Justice Hawkins at the Old Bailey on consecutive days in May. Seaman was the first to face the fearsome judge on Monday the 18th. He was indicted just for the murder of John Goodman Levy. Mr C.F. Gill and Horace Avery prosecuted. Seaman chose to defend himself. Outlining the case, Gill said that on Saturday morning, Jacob Meyer had gone to the local synagogue while his stepfather, John Goodman Levy, had stayed at home. The only person in the house was Annie Sarah Gale, Levy's housemaid, and Levy was on the ground floor and was also quite deaf. Mrs Gale was making the beds on the 3rd floor, and neither of them had saw or heard a man breaking in at the back of the house. The intruder made for the bedrooms in order to ransack them, whereupon he found Mrs Gale, who, judging by the smashed hand she had received from the intruder's hammer and the amount of blood splatters around the room, had put up quite a resistance before she was beaten unconscious and had her throat cut. The killer had then searched the room for any valuables, which he had collected before knocking a hole in the ceiling and climbing onto the roof. Here he stashed his ill-gotten gains before re-entering the building in search of more. Gill said that old Mr Levy probably didn't hear or see the burglar until it was too late, and he tried to escape to the WC, but he was too slow. The hammer split his skull, then his throat was cut with such ferocity his head was almost severed. The burglar then stripped the body of several gold rings, a heavy gold watch and a chain, and added them to his booty on the roof. The court then heard how a neighbour had spotted the intruder, the police were called, and Seaman was arrested when he jumped off the roof. The prisoner, when asked whether he had anything to say in his defence, stated he had nothing to say about the case, but that he desired to complain about a statement in a newspaper to the effect that he had previously been charged with an attempt to murder, an assault and theft, and that statement was false. The trial lasted barely a day. Before the black cap was draped on the judge's wig, Seaman was found guilty and sentenced to death. On the following day, it was the turn of Milsom and Fowler. Again, Mr. C.F. Gill and Horace Avery prosecuted. Mr. Hutton handled Fowler's defence, while Mr. Woodall represented Milsom. Referring to Milsom's statement that Fowler alone had committed the murder, Woodfall asked the judge for the two to be tried separately. After a brief consultation, it was refused. Opening for the Crown, Gill said that there was evidence that the two accused were responsible, based on Milsom's confession blaming Fowler and the discovery of the toy lantern that linked Milsom himself. He said that arming themselves with revolvers, they had gone on the run before being tracked down and detained. Throughout the hearing, Fowler remained like a statue, staring ahead and taking no notice of his cringing companion in the dock. Then, on day 2 of the trial, the jury were invited to retire to consider their verdict. When the foreman rose to say they found both guilty as charged, the silence that followed was broken by a scream from Milson, who had dropped to the floor as Fowler spun round and attempted to seize him. A warder made to grab Fowler, but could not get hold of the enraged prisoner, who made a desperate attempt to get his fingers around the throat of his companion in crime. Warders and police rushed towards the dock as chairs were broken and the glass front of the dock crashed in a shower of splinters. On the dock floor, 3 men struggled and 1 screamed. Finally, Fowler was restrained and dragged away as Milsom rose shakily to his feet as the black cap was draped on the judge's wig and Mr. Justice Hawkins prepared to deliver the death sentence. Before he did so, another prisoner sitting below the dock and waiting for her own trial for murder to open after the close of Milsom and Fowler's, rose with sharp indignation and claimed, "It's not safe for me to be here." A brief smile touched the face of Mr. Justice Hawkins. The woman was Amelia Dyer, infamous Reading baby farmer, who was to hear her own sentence to death proclaimed on the following day. By then the dock had been repaired. With 4 death sentences passed that week in the same court, it was initially decided that they should all hang together. The last time 4 people had been hanged side by side was 20 years earlier, when Marwood had hanged the Lenny mutineers, but it quickly decided that the men would hang on Tuesday the 9th of June, with Mrs. Dyer going to the scaffold on the following day. On Monday the 8th of June, Hangman James Billington and Assistant William Warwick, still at the time usually named Wilkinson, arrived at the prison to prepare for a rare triple execution at Newgate. It would be the first time 3 men were hanged side by side since James Berry had hanged the Netherby Hall murders at Carlisle a decade earlier. Billington was meant to have a second assistant, Robert Wade of Accrington, but earlier that day he had sent a telegram saying he would be unable to attend, and it was now too late to engage Thomas Scott, the only other active executioner. That Monday night, as the hangmen were preparing the scaffold, a prison van took Mrs. Dyer out of Newgate to Holloway Jail, where she would be spurred hearing the bell tolling the death of the 3 men. Tuesday morning brought dull and rainy, but despite this, well before the scheduled hour, the crowd stood outside the jail, 7 or 8 deep by the prison gate. Seaman and Fowler both remained calm in their respective cells, in contrast to Milsom, who was troubled and restless as he maintained his innocence and spent his last night making a number of incoherent, anguished cries. As Fowler chatted to his guard, he said, "I'm told people think I'm going to cut up rough tomorrow morning. They're mistaken. I'm satisfied. Milsom's a dirty turncoat, but I know I shall meet him level tomorrow morning, and I'm satisfied." When he woke, on his last morning on earth, Fowler asked the guards in a surly tone, "What time will it be?" 9 o'clock, one replied. "What about the little rat? Has he boot too?" "Yes, Milsom is to go too. He has not been reprieved." "Thank goodness for that," Fowler replied, as if nothing else now mattered. At a few minutes to 9, the executioners and prison officials assembled outside the condemned cells. All 3 were no longer wearing the arrow-marked fustian suits and were now dressed in the clothes they had last worn at their trials. Seaman was the first to be pinioned. With his right arm still damaged and in a sling, Billington had fashioned a special belt to secure his hands, and it took a minute or 2 to get it fastened up. Asked if he had anything to say, Seaman indifferently replied, "No, sir, I have nothing to say." Fowler was next. "Have you anything to say?" Under Sheriff Metcalfe asked. "No, only to thank all the officials for their kindness to me." Billington was then introduced to the prisoner, who shook his hand before Fowler placed his hands behind his back as if conversant with proceedings. He then suddenly became very unsteady, and the hangman shouted for a guard to give him a glass of brandy. Fowler downed it in one and then seemed to regain his composure. When it was Milsom's turn, with considerable fortitude, he responded to the under-sheriff's question by saying, "I am perfectly innocent, I am not guilty of the crime." The signal was then given for the procession to head outside to the execution shed, just a matter of yards away. Fowler stepped out of his cell and, with the warder on either side, walked firmly, now showing no sign of fear. Seaman followed, his injuries forcing him to limp. Seeing it was being placed between the other two, he turned to Warbrick and chuckled. "I suppose I am to act as the peacemaker." Milsom was last out of the cell, and Fowler took one last look round to make sure his erstwhile friend was following him to the scaffold. Within a minute all three were on the trapdoors, and as Billington placed a white cap and noose on each man, Warbrick strapped the ankles of Fowler and Seaman. As he was dealing with Milson, unseen by the warder standing on the plank supporting the condemned men, Billington pushed the lever, and the three men dropped to their death, followed through the trapdoor by the assistant hangman. There was no mention of this in the reports of the execution in the papers that day, with the report stating that the only sounds made were Milson crying for his wife. Despite a fall of some 10 feet, Warbrick was seemingly uninjured, as he was fit enough to assist Billington again on the following day when they hanged Amelia Dyer. However, word soon got into the press that there had been a gruesome incident at the execution, and that, in falling through the trapdoors, Warbrick had grabbed hold of Milson's legs. As a result, this had dislodged the noose, and the prisoner took several minutes to die from strangulation, and that at the inquest that morning, his features showed great signs of distress. 20 years later, William Warbrick wrote an account of his time as an assistant. One or two of the tales are from executions we know he wasn't present at, and it would seem that some of the anecdotes are journalistic fiction. Referring to this incident, he claimed that he was using a new strap for Milson's legs that was stiff, and he was struggling to locate a hole when he heard the bolts being drawn. As Billington pushed the lever, he had fallen through the trapdoor and was only saved from serious injury by grabbing hold of the condemned man's legs. While this may have been the case, it would seem likely if he had grabbed hold of one of the falling men, the extra weight on the rope would surely have resulted in Milsom's head being torn off. A government official commented on the incident a few weeks after the execution and claimed that while it was true Warbrick had disappeared into the pit, he had fallen away from the men, had not interfered with the execution in any way, and all went according to plan. A look at the LPC4 sheets that record the execution details show that in Milson's case, everything was as it should be, with just a 3-inch stretch. Fowler's, however, showed that there was a significantly longer stretch of the neck, some 9 inches, which would be more likely had he had the extra weight on the drop. Was there some incident or mishap that even Warbrick failed to acknowledge in his account? Whatever actually did happen that morning, with the various contradictory reports in the press and with all the files in the public domain, it is something I guess we shall never know. Two brutal crimes carried out by habitual and violent criminals, with the only point of note being whether Albert Milsom was guilty as charged or, as he claimed, innocent of playing an active part in the murder of the old man. The fact that he gladly received half of the spoils and then went on the run carrying a gun would suggest he deserved the same punishment as his partner in crime. Whether it was as a result of the incident with Warbrick falling through the trapdoors or not, there would be just one further triple execution, a month later at Winchester, with the same hangman and assistant engaged, and without incident. In 1928, there were 2 instances of 3 men being scheduled to hang for the same crime. At Cardiff, the authorities arranged for 2 to be hanged together at 8, with the third going to the gallows 90 minutes later. And where 3 men were convicted for a murder in Brighton, one was to hang at Pentonville, with the other 2 at Wandsworth. In the case from Cardiff, one was found to be insane and sent to Broadmoor, and just 2 were hanged side by side, whilst in the other case, all 3 were reprieved less than 24 hours before they were due to hang. The last double execution in the country took place in 1954. You'll be watching another episode of Tales from the Hangman's Record. Until the next time, thank you and goodbye.